The other thing that you're seeing at the moment, Rafe, is complete two-tier mainstream media coverage of Nigel Farage. This is constant. So I wanted to show you Richard Keys, remember him, the disgraced sports broadcaster. Yesterday he posted on X this picture of Nigel Farage lunching at Scott's in Mayfair. He said in the most expensive street in the UK. To be fair, I'm certain he was working on constituency business, although it didn't sound like it. Contrasted very nicely in this post by Dr. David Jeffrey, who wrote, Angela Rayner clubbing equals everyone needs a holiday. Nigel Farage having lunch equals how come he's not talking about Clacton 24/7? Bore. And this actually, I know it can be viewed as a light-hearted issue, Rafe, but it infuriates me because the bias permeates the mainstream media now when it comes to every story. So we've seen over the past 24 hours the complete sympathy from Kay Burley on Sly News, from ITV News, from all of the mainstream media about the fact that Angela Rayner was criticised for going and making a fool of herself. There she is by dancing like a drunken teenager in a club in Ibiza. And they think that's great. And actually, if you criticize her, then you're clearly against a working class hero and you're clearly sexist. But when Nigel Farage had the cheek to go to the RNC over a weekend, by the way, to visit his mate Donald Trump just after the assassination attempt, remember, he was literally hounded. I mean, you had Channel 4 News and Emily Maitlis chasing him through the convention centre. So there is a two-tier media.
There's a two-tier media, and it's done with a great deal of venom and hatred, which you don't really see. And because there's hypocrisy on both sides of the political spectrum, but the venom with which you see it coming from one direction, almost literally, becoming swivel-eyed with the way in which they do it. I mean, Richard Keys, who posted this tweet, this is a man who is giving a moral lecture, and he left his wife to get married to his daughter's best friend, who was half his age. He lives in Qatar, right? The world's leader probably in human rights abuses, at least for the Indian workers and so forth who live there. A terrible place to live if you were actually a moral person, you would have thought. I don't know how much he's earning in Qatar. I mean, the hypocrisy of this is sort of champagne socialism at its very worst. But of course, this sort of hypocrisy, it goes far beyond just the personalities we're talking about, I mean, you remember, the left will forgive people on the left for doing the same things people on the right do in politics. So Obama deported twice the number of people that Trump did in any given year, including in those cages. Blind eye turned to all of that. Obama did 10 times more airstrikes than George W. Bush. For some reason, the left media never spoke about any of that. Now, of course, we've got places like Germany talking about the Rwanda plan, and I'm sure the media will skirt over that issue as soon as they can. Germany, of course, led by a social democratic chancellor on the left.
Well, what about the hypocrisy, Rafe, when it comes to the fact that today Labour has admitted they are considering this plan of using Estonian prisons to house criminals from the UK? Now, in theory, I don't actually have a problem with that, but how is it any different to deporting illegals to Rwanda?
It's not at all. I mean, for heaven's sake, what people have to remember is that in 2004, Tony Blair and the New Labour back then were having discussions about deporting asylum seekers to Tanzania. That's conveniently forgotten about, and plans went very far down that sort of road. The hypocrisy here stinks, and that's what really strikes at the heart of British decency. I mean, the British people hate hypocrisy more than anything else, from your personal life to your politics. If you're a hypocrite, you deserve to be slung out of office. And the more that people see of this, I mean, and that's one of the reasons, of course, you had all the issues about the COVID parties, and number 10 is the hypocrisy, is double standards and all the rest of it. And the more people see this from Labour, the sooner they'll be turfed out of office.
And it is only Reform UK providing opposition now on any front. I know the Conservative Party is going through a leadership election, but they have literally departed the field. And this is in all areas. And I was really grateful to see Zia Youssef, again, the Reform UK chairman, taking on this complete lunatic and weirdo, actually, Ed Miliband, writing British people's energy bills are unaffordable and keep going up. This is the state of our Secretary of State for Energy. This Labour government is heading for the rocks. And he posted this video of Ed Miliband, which if you haven't seen it, I mean, cringe away.
So my friend is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. So here I am on the latest stage of my GB Energy Tour.
And his answers, Rafe, are going to bankrupt us in the wind.
You're quite right. You would have thought that the man responsible for the Ed Stone, the man photographed, eating that ham sandwich so ghastly,
or failing to,
would have learned his lesson about PR operations and so forth. I mean, look, every single expert knows that this idea to try to get net zero by 2030 is simply unachievable. Even the greatest supporters of it say, it can't be done before at least 2035. And yet, and we've now been told, of course, unofficially, that this will potentially, this vainglorious attempt to achieve the unattainable will cost potentially, hundreds of billions of pounds. And, where is the Conservative Party in all of this? You're quite right to praise the chairman of the Reform Party. The people in this country have not had a genuine Conservative government since 1997. Instead, they've had almost 30 years of a uniparty, a centrist uniparty, a leftist uniparty, New Labour versus, New Labour Light. And the Reform Party would not exist if the Conservative Party had actually been, conservative. How about that? They are conservative in name only. I've said for a long time they should be renamed the Neoliberal Party because they don't have a truly conservative, high Tory sort of bone in their body. And anyone anyone in the media who thinks that reform is beyond the pale and extreme, they simply either weren't alive in the 80s and 90s or they got a very short memory, because the policies that reform takes on things, from immigration to culture, is simply the traditional conservatism.
Well, of course, Thatcher would be described as far right now, wouldn't she, Rafe? That is the reality. Thatcher would be viewed probably as too conservative for the Conservative Party. So you know Farage, right? You know him personally. You know what he's like. What does he need to do to become Prime Minister, and does he have it in him?
I think Nigel Farage certainly has the ability to be a prime minister, and a very effective prime minister, particularly under first past the post, if he can dominate. Because you have to remember, since the Second World War, not a single government has been elected with more than 50% of the of votes cast. So you only need about a third of the votes cast to do it. So it's not impossible. He needs to essentially, I would say, with greatest respect to him, trust other people to also carry the burden of reform on their shoulders too. And that means, not being worried about having potentially other bright sparks and bright lights alongside him. And I think if he assembles a really powerful team of people who are also charismatic and eloquent, then I think there is a very clear path to the people, because the public are calling out for change. They're calling for an end to this the uniparty and reform and other small parties emerging, and these are like weeds trying to break through the cement that has held down politics in this country for too long. The British people have been betrayed by the Tory party. They're being betrayed by the Labour Party, and they need change. And so the imperative is on reform to meet those needs. It's their duty to their country.
But all right, guys, it is the best time of year because football is back. We're talking Premier League in the UK, in the US, NFL Sundays and college football Saturdays. And with that comes the glorious grind of fantasy football lineup. So this is where your inner manager comes alive, setting the perfect fantasy roster, screaming at your TV and making last-minute waiver moves that either make you a hero or the guy everyone ridicules in the group chat. But listen, while you're over there making sure your fantasy team is dialed in, don't let your personal grooming become the guy that gets left on the bench. Let's be honest, nobody wants to fumble their grooming routine. And that's where Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0 Ultra comes in, acting as your all-in-one grooming playbook. From keeping things sharp down below with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra to taking care of those rogue nose and ear hairs with the Weed Whacker 2.0, this is the lineup that'll keep you looking and feeling like a champ on and off the field. It will help you feel clean, confident, and ready to dominate your fantasy league. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra Groin and Body Hair Trimmer is the franchise player of your grooming roster with precise trimming capabilities. It's reliable, efficient, and gets the job done without fumbling. Whether it's for date night, a weekend tailgate, or just everyday grooming, this is the tool you want on your squad. No one wants a surprise nose or ear hair making a guest appearance on the game day. That's why the Weed Whacker 2.0 handles those details like a pro, keeping you neat and ready to go. No missed tackles in your grooming gang. And the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra doesn't stop at grooming and essentials. It also comes with 2 free gifts: the Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag. Premium gear to ensure you're always ready for action, whether at home or on the road. Join the over 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. Use the code Outspoken for 20% off and free shipping. Trust me, you'll be drafting the real MVP of grooming this season. www.manscaped.com. Use the code Outspoken at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Stay on top of your grooming gang and be ready for anything this season throws your way. But breaking right now, Rafe, there is a massive shift going on in terms of the tectonic plates in British politics, proven by an election yesterday that you won't hear much about in the mainstream media, but the results are absolutely fascinating. Let's look at this post on X from Zia Youssef, who is the chairman of Reform UK, who writes, Reform has all the momentum in British politics and is bearing down on Labour. Crewe West has been a Labour stronghold. Yesterday's by-election result, big swing from Labour to Reform. So even though Labour has a very high vote here, 43%, look at this, Rafe, down 19%. Reform, brand new entry, 26%. The Tories at 17%. And then you go down to the more minor parties well below. So I'm sorry, Rafe, I believe Reform UK is now the second party in British politics. Am I wrong?
Don't apologize for it. I mean, this is a fundamental moment actually in British politics for a potential realignment. You know, we had the realignment actually in 2019 when small c patriotic Labour voters lent their votes to the Tories in 2019 with Boris Johnson. Unfortunately, we then had COVID and all of the money that could have been used for levelling up was spent on furlough and lockdown. And so reluctantly, those voters then turned to Labour at the last election. But they are fair weather friends of Labour. They're not really allied to Labour at all. And Reform, you can clearly see now, is seizing on that opportunity. And it's only been 2 months, as I've said, into the Labour government, where I think you have buyer's remorse with so many people who cast their votes for Labour when they naively didn't realise that what we're seeing now is actually the true colour of Labour. You know, Starmer said one thing to become leader of the Labour Party and betrayed the Labour Party members. He said another thing to become Prime Minister and he's betrayed Labour voters, people for the winter fuel allowance and so forth. But now the imperative is on the Reform Party not to drop the ball. The key thing.
So what do they need to do? What do they need to do?
They need to professionalize and they need to understand that they are no longer an outsider campaigning party. They are now within the walls of Parliament. And they need to be, in my sense, a bit more like the SNP. They need one single key cause to follow. SNP, that's independence. For the Reform Party, it must be immigration, 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 to paraphrase Tony Blair. I've said for a few years, actually, if there was an immigration party alone with that title, it would have done hugely well at the election. That needs to be the Reform's core thing to campaign on. But then, of course, having proper policies across the board. And it needs to have a dedicated policy unit, which I don't think it currently has very well so far. It may be wrong on that, but I don't think it has. And it needs to actually present itself as being a legitimate opposition and a contender to eventually become the ruling government of this country.
Well, do you know what I find fascinating, Rafe? I genuinely think that the Labour Party and the mainstream media have realised now that Reform UK could be in government in 2029. I've predicted even before the last election that we will have Prime Minister Farage in 2029. Some people might say I'm crazy, but let's see. But look at the attacks that are now coming. So this was in the Times this week. They have described Reform UK as a danger. They have described Reform UK policies as loopy. But the thing that I actually found most disgusting was this quote from a serving Labour MP, we don't know who, because of course they're completely gutless, describing Reform UK members as, quote, keyboard warriors, and saying many of these are in their Transformers pyjamas in their mum's basement, but what we haven't seen yet is Reform on the doorstep or speaking to voters. Now, obviously that's grossly offensive, but isn't it also a massive miscalculation, Rafe? Because this is always what the political elites do when they're trying to demonize a certain sector of society. They did it with Brexit voters. Well, they lost. They lost as a result.
Yeah, and you could mention Hillary Clinton's deplorables, right?
Yes.
Or the swivel-eyed loons that David Cameron referred to UKIP members as well. You're precisely right. It's that same condescension. It's the idea that we are the elite and the educated class and we understand things better than you do. And that patronizing tone no longer works. But what's, I think, actually also equally fascinating is that there is so much of this bile projected towards Reform and their 5 MPs. Meanwhile, we have 4 pro-Palestinian MPs who were elected on a one-issue mandate, and that was Palestine. No concern about education or healthcare.
Yeah.
And now
Corbyn, and don't forget Jeremy Corbyn leading the pack.
Forming a 5 MP bloc now with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, we don't know. You think Reform could be Prime Minister, could be the government in 5 years? You may well be right. They could sink or swim in the next 5 years. What we do know is that Islamic sectarian politics is here to stay, and those 4 or 5 seats are only going to get larger. That should be striking fear into the hearts of any traditional liberal, let alone conservative. If you believe in women's rights and gay rights and everything else, you should be generally worried.
It terrifies me. It terrifies me. And then you've got Labour saying, oh, we're going to make Islamophobia illegal. I mean, it's nuts.
Well, of course, what we're seeing here are attempts, because, of course, the Labour realizes the threat that the Islamic sectarianism poses to its own electoral chances, because they always depended on the Muslim vote. And so when you see them having these arms embargoes against Israel, and when you see this proposed Islamophobic legislation, which is so chilling, these are all ways in which they're trying to win back that lost Islamic vote. And, you know, and this follows just after we've had the government strike down the Higher Education Free Speech Act. You know, this Islamophobia legislation, which will come in either a standalone legislation or in a new Race Equalities Act, is going to be so chilling, because it's going to use what we call the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia, which essentially will mean that if anyone perceives something that you say to be an attack on Muslimness, whatever that means, you'll be guilty. So if you condemn child marriages, if you condemn first cousin marriages, if you can condemn polygamy, even if you start attacking the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, you could potentially fall foul of this. And even Sikhs are upset now in the Times yesterday, because of course the Sikhs endured the most terrible torture at the hands of Muslims historically, and if you make reference to that, they're now fearful that they could also become criminalized for that. This is the face of the Labour Party in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's totally terrifying, actually. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please do subscribe if you want lots more clips and interviews like that. Plus, if you want to watch our totally uncensored after show, then visit www.outspoken.live.